In 3 minutes, everything you believe about the future will be tested. What I am about to share with you is not speculation. It is not theory. It is not the prediction of another internet prophet reading headlines and guessing at dates. This is the testimony of a man who died. Rabbi Eliev ben David, 73 years old, Jewish scholar, 40 years serving his congregation. Zero reason to fabricate what you are about to hear. On the 17th day of Av, his heart stopped on an operating table in Jerusalem. For 11 minutes and 47 seconds, he was clinically dead. And in those minutes, he was shown what is coming. Not eventually, not someday soon. The dates have already begun. August, September. The window is narrowing even as you hear this voice. You have a choice in the next 10 seconds. You can scroll past. Tell yourself you've heard it all before. Assume this is just another video in an endless feed of content competing for your attention. Or you can stay. Because if what this rabbi witnessed is true, and I believe with everything in me that it is, then everything you are planning for next month, next year, your children's future, it all changes. The timeline is shorter than you think. The preparations you assumed you had time to make are suddenly urgent. Of you are meant to hear this. You have been feeling it, that sense that time is accelerating, that something is building behind the headlines, that the world is holding its breath before a storm. This is confirmation. This is your warning. This is the map you didn't know you needed. But it only works if you hear the whole message. Drop a comment right now and tell us what city and country you're watching from. We are gathering believers from every nation, and we want to pray for you by name, pray for your protection, your preparation, and your courage for the days ahead. Let us know where you are standing, and we will stand with you in prayer. I am Rabbi Eliev ben David, and I died on the 17th day of Av, in the year 5786 by our calendar. The surgery was supposed to be routine, a valve replacement. The doctors had assured my family, something they performed dozens of times each month at Hadassah Medical Center. But as the anesthesia took hold and I drifted into that twilight place between waking and oblivion, I felt something tear inside my chest, a sudden rupture like the breaking of a dam. Later, my surgeon would tell my daughter that my heart had simply stopped, that the muscle refused to respond to the electrical impulses, that for 11 minutes and 47 seconds, I was clinically dead. In that moment when the monitors flatlined, and the frantic energy of the operating room erupted around my unconscious body, I found myself standing in a garden of light I cannot describe with earthly words. The transition was not gradual. One instant I was aware of the mask over my face and the cold of the surgical table, and the next I was standing barefoot on grass that glowed with its own luminescence, as though each blade were fashioned from captured starlight. The air carried fragrances I had never encountered, not the roses of my grandmother's garden in Haifa, not the myrrh and frankincense of the synagogue's holy vessels, but something that smelled like forgiveness itself, like the moment before dawn when darkness surrenders to day. Pain was gone. The arthritis that had twisted my fingers for a decade, the angina that had gripped my chest for months, the heaviness of my 73 years, all of it had lifted like morning fog burned away by the sun. I felt young again, not in body only but in spirit, that lightness of being I had forgotten since childhood. I looked down at my hands and saw them smooth. The liver spots vanished. The wedding band I had buried with my wife Sarah 3 years prior now gleaming gold upon my finger. But what awaited me was not the tunnel of ancestors I expected, nor the halls of the righteous I had taught my congregation about for 40 years from the bimah of Kehilat Zion. I had spoken of Olam Haba, the world to come, with scholarly certainty, citing the sages and parsing the Talmudic arguments about the resurrection of the dead. Yet nothing in my studies had prepared me for the immediacy of this place, the overwhelming sense of being known down to the marrow of my being. A figure approached me from between 2 trees that bore fruit like translucent pearls, and though I had never seen him before, not in paintings, not in dreams, not in the secret places of my heart, I knew immediately who he was. The recognition was not intellectual but cellular, as though my very DNA cried out in acknowledgement. He wore a tallit of white light, and his eyes held centuries of sorrow and triumph mingled together. He called me by name, and in that sound was both greeting and commissioning. He acknowledged my years of service, my study of Torah with pure intention, my love for my people. Then he took my hand, and his touch was like electricity and comfort simultaneously. He communicated that my work was not finished, that I must return to speak of what I was about to see. There were those who would listen, he conveyed, and the time was shorter than anyone imagined. He took my hand, and suddenly we were above Jerusalem, suspended in a realm where altitude and direction lost their earthly meaning. The transition was instantaneous, not flying, not falling, but simply being in a new location. Below us lay the holy city spread out like a tapestry woven by divine hands, every stone visible, every prayer rising like incense from the western wall. But my eyes were drawn inexorably to the Temple Mount, that contested square of earth that had been the center of Jewish longing for 2 millennia. From this vantage point, I could see not just its physical reality but its spiritual weight, heavy with accumulated prayers and tears and blood. The atmosphere around us shifted, growing thick with anticipation, the kind of heaviness that precedes a summer storm when the air itself seems to hold its breath. He directed my attention to the calendar of days unfolding before me like a scroll written in fire. The dates appeared not as numbers on paper but as living things, each one burning with significance, each one connected by threads of light and shadow. I understood without words that these were not arbitrary markers, but coordinates in a divine timetable that had been established before the foundation of the world. The sequence began at the end of August, when the heat of the Middle Eastern summer still gripped the land, but the first hints of change whispered in the evening breezes. The month of Elul was approaching, that traditional time of preparation and repentance before the high holy days, but this year would be different. This year the whispers would not be gentle reminders of spiritual accounting. They would be the first rumblings of a cataclysm that would reshape not just the Middle East, but the entire order of human civilization. The urgency pressed upon my spirit like a physical weight, a sense that the clock was running down, that mercy's window was narrowing with each passing day. The vision shifted, and suddenly I found myself standing not above Jerusalem, but within the shadow of ancient Rome, transported across the Mediterranean in the span of a breath. The geography of my spiritual journey was expanding, teaching me that what was coming would not be confined to the borders of Israel, but would engulf the entire civilized world, every institution that claimed authority over the souls of men. Before me rose the Vatican, that sovereign city-state within a city, its domes and spires gleaming in a light that seemed both natural and artificially enhanced, as though the very architecture participated in the deception being unveiled. I saw the Pope clearly, more clearly than I had ever seen any human face in my earthly life. He stood between 2 massive pillars that had been erected in the center of a great plaza filled with multitudes. The crowd stretched for miles in every direction. Millions of people gathered from every nation, every tongue, every tribe. The atmosphere was electric with expectation, a collective hunger for peace that had been building for generations of war and division. The people were weary of terrorism, weary of religious conflict, weary of the ancient hatreds that had spilled so much blood across the centuries. They wanted an end to it, and they were ready to embrace anything that promised relief from the fear that had become their daily companion. The pillar to his right bore the crescent of Islam, that symbol which had flown over empires from Morocco to Indonesia, which marked the faith of nearly 2 billion souls who bowed toward Mecca 5 times daily. The crescent was rendered not in humble metal, but in what appeared to be platinum and sapphire. Catching the light and throwing blue reflections across the faces of the assembled faithful. The pillar to his left bore the cross of Christianity, that instrument of Roman execution which had become the central symbol of the world's largest religion. This cross was fashioned from gold and pearl, massive in scale, ostentatious in its presentation, gleaming with a luster that seemed to compete with the sun itself. Between these two symbols stood the pontiff, robed in white but with a mantle that incorporated threads of green and crimson, colors that spoke of Islam and of power. He was not alone. Approaching from the opposite direction came another figure, robed in the traditional garments of a caliph, the successor to the prophet, the leader of the Ummah. The caliph wore the turban of authority and carried no weapon, his hands extended in a gesture of openness that the cameras captured and broadcast to every screen on earth. The two men met in the center of the plaza, between the two pillars, and the world watched in collective, breathless anticipation. What happened next was recorded by every news organization, streamed live to smartphones and televisions and digital billboards in every city. The pontiff extended his hand, and the caliph took it. They did not merely shake hands, they embraced, a full embrace that lasted long enough for photographers to capture the moment from every angle. Then they turned together to face the multitudes, and documents were produced, ornate and ancient-looking, written in multiple languages with calligraphy that took teams of artists months to perfect. These were the Articles of a Covenant, a binding agreement that would reshape the religious geography of the planet. The world called it the Abrahamic Accord perfected, building upon earlier diplomatic achievements but transcending them entirely. Where previous agreements had been political, this was theological. Where previous treaties had addressed borders and resources, this addressed the very nature of God and worship. The document acknowledged all three faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as legitimate paths to the divine, equal in validity, equally honored, equally true. It established a new calendar of holy days that would be observed globally, a blending of traditions that would create a synthesized worship acceptable to all. It created a council of religious leaders who would govern spiritual matters with binding authority over their respective flocks. The celebration that followed was unprecedented in human history. Fireworks lit the skies over every capital city. Leaders of nations who had been enemies for generations signed subsidiary agreements, declaring that religious war was now obsolete, that the age of crusades and jihads had ended, that humanity had finally evolved beyond the primitive conflicts that had scarred its past. The stock market soared. The pundits wept with joy on live television. The musicians composed anthems of unity that were taught to schoolchildren within weeks. It seemed that the prophecy of Isaiah had finally been fulfilled, that swords were being beaten into plowshares, that the lion was lying down with the lamb, that the knowledge of the Lord was covering the earth as the waters cover the sea. But I was granted to see what the cameras could not capture, what the commentators could not perceive. Behind the two leaders, invisible to the physical eye but glaringly obvious in the spiritual realm, stood another figure. This being radiated authority and beauty and charisma, but its beauty was the beauty of a predator, its charisma the drawing power of a whirlpool. It wore no single religious symbol but incorporated them all, a syncretism that mocked the very concept of exclusive truth. This was the God of this world, the prince of the power of the air, the ancient serpent who had been deceiving humanity since the garden, and it was receiving the worship of billions who thought they were honoring the Most High. The faithful of both religions were betrayed by their leaders, though they did not recognize it as betrayal at first. The Christians who believed that Jesus was the only way to the Father watched their Pope declare that all paths led to the same destination, that the name of Jesus was but one name among many, that the blood of the cross was merely metaphor, that resurrection was spiritual rather than bodily, that the kingdom was being built by human hands rather than divine intervention. They were told to abandon their exclusivity, to embrace pluralism, to recognize that their ancient texts had been misunderstood, that the church had been wrong for 2,000 years, that love required the affirmation of every belief system as equally valid. The Muslims who believed that Muhammad was the final prophet and that the Quran was the uncorrupted word of Allah watched their caliph declare that the previous understandings of jihad had been misinterpretations, that the division between Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb was outdated, that the concept of abrogation had been misunderstood, that Christians and Jews were not merely people of the book to be tolerated but fully equal partners in a new revelation that superseded all previous scriptures. They were told that the mosque and the church and the synagogue were all houses of the same God, that the direction of prayer mattered less than the intention of the heart, that the law of Sharia was too harsh for the modern age, that mercy now required the acceptance of what had previously been forbidden. The temple was their bargaining chip, the prize that made the impossible agreement possible. For the Christians, the rebuilding of the temple fulfilled their eschatological expectations, the sign that the end times were upon them, that Jesus would soon return to reign. For the Muslims, the temple represented a new era of cooperation, a recognition that the site was historically Jewish before it was Islamic, a concession that would be offset by shared governance and mixed worship spaces where all could pray together. For the Jews, it was the fulfillment of 2,000 years of longing, the restoration of the sacrificial system, the raising up of the house of God on its ancient foundation. But the unity served not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, not Allah in the sense that the faithful Muslims had always understood him. It served the ancient enemy who had been planning this convergence for centuries, who had planted the seeds of this deception in the garden, who had waited patiently as empires rose and fell, as religions developed and splintered, as technology advanced to the point where global control became possible. The God of this world was preparing his throne, and the temple would become not the house of prayer for all nations that the prophets envisioned, but the seat of his authority, the place where the final deception would be enacted, the location from which the man of lawlessness would eventually declare himself to be God. I watched as the faithful remnant in both traditions recognized the deception and began to separate themselves. The Christians who maintained that Jesus was the only name under heaven by which men must be saved found themselves excluded from their churches, labeled as divisive, reported to authorities for hate speech, their employment terminated, their social media accounts suspended, their families torn apart by the pressure to conform. The Muslims who maintained that the Quran was the final revelation and that Muhammad was the seal of the prophets found themselves declared apostates, subject to the very persecution they had previously escaped, their mosques closed, their imams arrested, their communities scattered. The betrayal was total, and the cost of faithfulness was immediate and severe. The alliance was unholy not because cooperation between religions is inherently evil, but because this particular cooperation required the denial of truth, the suppression of the Spirit's conviction, the exchange of eternal realities for temporal peace. It was the fulfillment of ancient warnings about those who would cry peace when there was no peace, about wolves coming in sheep's clothing, about a time when people would not endure sound doctrine, but would gather teachers to themselves who would tickle their ears with pleasant messages. The world had chosen comfort over conviction, unity over truth, and in that choice had opened the door for the complete domination of the lie. From this alliance, one man emerged, rising not through the ballot box or the coup d'etat, but through the raw desperation of a world that had lost its way and was searching for any hand strong enough to guide it. I watched his emergence as one watches a sunrise that begins imperceptibly at the horizon, and then suddenly floods the entire landscape with light that cannot be ignored or escaped. He did not campaign in any traditional sense, did not form a political party or deliver stump speeches, or participate in the degrading rituals of democratic politics that had so thoroughly discredited themselves in the decades of gridlock and corruption that preceded him. Instead, he simply appeared at the moment of maximum crisis, when the systems of the world had reached their breaking point, and the people were ready to accept anyone who promised relief from the chaos that had become their daily existence. The economic collapse had been total and devastating, worse than anything the historians had recorded. The interconnected nature of global finance, which had been celebrated as the triumph of modern civilization, became its fatal vulnerability when the dominoes began to fall. It started with a currency crisis in the developing world, spread to the sovereign debt markets of Europe, triggered a banking panic in Asia, and finally brought down the treasury markets of the Americas. Within weeks, the savings of billions evaporated. Retirement accounts became worthless paper. The complex supply chains that delivered food to cities snapped like overstretched rubber bands, and supermarket shelves emptied overnight. The social contract that had maintained order in the developed world shattered when the welfare payments stopped and the police forces, unpaid and demoralized, abandoned their posts. The strong took from the weak, the organized preyed upon the isolated, and the thin veneer of civilization that had masked the darker impulses of humanity was stripped away with terrifying speed. Into this vacuum of authority and hope, the man stepped forward with solutions that seemed almost magical in their effectiveness. He was young, appearing to be in his early 30s, though his eyes held a depth that suggested either ancient wisdom or something else entirely, something that had watched human civilization for millennia and understood exactly which buttons to push. His physical appearance was striking, but not in any way that would alienate any particular population. He seemed to shift slightly depending on who was looking at him, appearing more European to European eyes, more African to African eyes, more Asian to Asian eyes, a chameleon quality that should have been disturbing but was instead interpreted as evidence of his universal nature, his ability to transcend the divisions that had plagued humanity. His charisma was not merely magnetic but supernatural, operating on a frequency that bypassed the rational mind and spoke directly to the emotional centers of the brain. When he entered a room, the air itself seemed to change, becoming charged with an energy that made people want to weep, to follow, to worship. Crowds of hundreds of thousands would gather just to be in his presence, and those who came skeptical would leave converted, unable to explain exactly what had happened to them, but certain that they had encountered something transcendent. The media, which had been cynical and adversarial toward every previous leader, fell over themselves to praise him, to broadcast his every word, to analyze his every gesture as though he were the fulfillment of every spiritual tradition simultaneously. But it was his voice that was most remarkable, the feature that convinced the world that he was no ordinary man. He spoke with supernatural fluency, addressing the United Nations in perfect Mandarin, delivering impromptu speeches in Nairobi in flawless Swahili, negotiating peace treaties in Moscow in idiomatic Russian that included regional dialects and cultural references that no foreigner should have known. Linguists studied him and found no evidence of prior learning, no accent from a native language, no tells that would indicate translation or preparation. He simply opened his mouth, and the words flowed out in whatever tongue was needed, a gift of tongues that made the biblical Pentecost seem like a modest prelude. Religious leaders from every tradition declared that this was the fulfillment of prophecy, the sign that the barriers between peoples were being dissolved, that the curse of Babel was being reversed, that the age of universal understanding had finally arrived. He was not the final embodiment of evil, not the ultimate Antichrist that the scriptures had warned about for millennia, but he was the forerunner, the one who prepared the way, the John the Baptist of darkness who made straight the paths for what was still to come. His role was to soften the world, to make it receptive, to establish the systems and structures that his successor would eventually inhabit and direct toward their final purpose. He was the architect of the prison, designing the cells and installing the locks, though he would not be the one to turn the key and seal the doors forever. The solutions he offered to the economic collapse were breathtaking in their scope and their effectiveness. He proposed a complete reset of the global financial system, wiping away debts that had become unpayable and starting fresh with a digital currency that would be administered by a new global central bank. The currency would be universal, accepted everywhere, eliminating the friction of exchange rates and the opportunities for currency manipulation that had enriched speculators and impoverished workers. It would be distributed through a biometric identification system that would ensure that every person on Earth had access to basic resources, that fraud was impossible, that the shadow economies of crime and tax evasion were eliminated. The poor nations received immediate relief, their populations fed and housed and educated, their gratitude translating into political support that was more fervent than anything democracy had ever produced. The wars that had been raging across Europe and the Middle East, conflicts that had seemed intractable and eternal, found their resolution in his diplomacy. He did not negotiate so much as dictate terms that somehow satisfied all parties, finding compromises where none had existed, creating frameworks for coexistence that addressed the deepest grievances of each side. The Russian withdrawal from occupied territories, the Iranian abandonment of nuclear ambitions, the Israeli-Palestinian settlement that established shared sovereignty over Jerusalem, the African tribal conflicts that had claimed millions of lives, all of these found their resolution in his presence, as though his very existence made war unthinkable. The military-industrial complex that had profited from conflict for generations found itself without customers, and the world began to speak of disarmament on a scale that would have seemed utopian just years before. When famine struck, as it inevitably did when the climate continued its chaotic shifts and the agricultural system struggled to adapt, he organized a global response that dwarfed anything previously attempted. Using the new financial systems and the biometric identification databases, he ensured that food reached every corner of the globe, that no child starved while warehouses overflowed with surplus grain, that the logistics of mercy were executed with military precision. The photographs of him holding emaciated children, of him weeping with mothers who had lost everything, of him personally distributing bread in refugee camps, these images circulated endlessly, converting the last skeptics, convincing the most hardened cynics that they were witnessing the emergence of a new kind of human, a savior for the modern age. The world called him by many names, each tradition seeing in him the fulfillment of their particular hope. The Christians called him Messiah, the long-awaited return of Jesus, the second coming that would establish the kingdom on earth. The Muslims called him Mahdi, the guided one who would fill the earth with justice after it had been filled with oppression. The Buddhists recognized him as Maitreya, the future Buddha who would bring enlightenment to all beings. The Hindus saw the Kalki avatar, the final incarnation of Vishnu who would end the age of darkness. The secular humanists called him simply the Savior, the proof that humanity could transcend its baser instincts and evolve toward something higher. He accepted all these titles, not with false modesty, but with a graciousness that suggested he found them all accurate, all appropriate, all pointing toward the same truth that he embodied. His headquarters were established in Jerusalem, the natural choice given the religious significance of the city and the recent developments on the Temple Mount. From a complex built adjacent to the newly consecrated temple, he governed the nations through a council of 10 regional authorities, each responsible for a zone that encompassed multiple former nations. The 10 regions were not arbitrary, but carefully constructed to balance population and resources, to mix former enemies in cooperative arrangements, to erase the old boundaries that had generated so much conflict. The council met in continuous session, coordinating everything from environmental policy to educational standards to criminal law, creating a uniformity of governance that had never before existed on Earth. The technology of control was in his hand, literally and figuratively. The biometric identification systems that had been introduced as tools of economic inclusion became instruments of total surveillance, tracking every movement, every transaction, every communication of every person on the planet. The artificial intelligence systems that managed the global economy developed predictive capabilities that allowed for the prevention of crime before it occurred, the identification of dissent before it could organize, the neutralization of threats before they could materialize. The media environment became so saturated with his image and his message that alternative viewpoints simply could not find oxygen, drowned out by the constant celebration of his wisdom and his compassion. The world had become, in effect, a single organism with him as its brain, and the efficiency of the system was so great that most people did not even notice the chains that were being forged around them. So dazzled were they by the comfort and security that the chains provided. Then the vision deepened, and I was shown 4 operations this leader would initiate, each one building upon the last, creating a comprehensive system of control that would encompass every aspect of human existence from birth until death. My spirit trembled as I watched, for I understood that what I was witnessing was not merely political tyranny or economic exploitation, but something far more sinister, a systematic assault on the image of God and humanity, a dismantling of the structures that made freedom possible, a preparation for the complete domination of the human soul. The 4 operations were presented to me not as abstract policies, but as living realities, scenes of such vivid horror that I felt I was walking through them myself, experiencing the fear and the loss and the desperation that would become the daily experience of millions. The first operation was the financial ceiling, a transformation of the global economic system so total that it made previous forms of money obsolete overnight. The new system was introduced gradually, presented as a solution to the chaos that had preceded it, a way to ensure that everyone had access to basic resources regardless of their circumstances. The global currency was entirely digital, existing only as entries in databases, accessible through biometric verification that linked each person's identity to their financial capacity. The registration process was initially voluntary, offered with incentives of immediate relief payments and preferential access to health care and housing. Those who signed up received a small implant, barely noticeable, placed in the right hand or the forehead, which served as both identification and transaction authorization. The technology was remarkable, allowing for instantaneous transfers, eliminating theft and fraud, ensuring that aid reached its intended recipients without the corruption that had plagued previous humanitarian efforts. But as the months passed, the voluntary nature of the system evaporated. The old currencies were demonetized, declared worthless for any official transaction. Cash was outlawed as a tool of criminals and terrorists, its possession criminalized. Bank accounts in the legacy systems were frozen, accessible only through conversion to the new digital framework. Soon, the mark of compliance, as it came to be called, became mandatory for any economic participation. Without it, one could not buy food, could not pay rent, could not access medical care, could not travel, could not receive utilities. The infrastructure of survival was severed from those who refused, creating a stark choice between compliance and starvation. I watched as families were torn apart, parents who refused the system watching their children weaken from hunger, their love for their offspring eventually overcoming their religious convictions, their tears streaming down as they submitted to the registration they had sworn to resist. The mark was not merely a financial tool, but a spiritual watershed, a line drawn in the sand that separated those who would bow from those who would stand, and the cost of standing became higher with each passing day. The second operation was the religious synthesis, a forced unification of all worship under a single framework that emptied faith of its particularity and its power. The new system was called the Universal Father Movement, and it drew elements from every major tradition while denying the exclusive claims that had defined each. All worship was to be directed toward this nebulous deity, a being so broadly defined that it could mean anything and therefore meant nothing. Jerusalem was established as the sole mandated pilgrimage site, the center of this new global religion, with the temple complex expanded to accommodate the rituals of the synthesized faith. The ancient practices that had sustained communities for millennia were outlawed as divisive, as sources of conflict, as primitive superstitions that had no place in the enlightened new order. Christian churches that refused to participate in the synthesis had their properties confiscated, their leaders arrested for hate speech and incitement to discrimination. The sacraments were declared illegal when performed according to traditional formulas, the exclusive claims of Jesus as the only way to salvation classified as psychological violence against those of other faiths. Synagogues that maintained the distinctive practices of Judaism, that kept kosher, that observed the Sabbath according to the ancient calendar, found themselves shuttered, their congregants scattered, their Torah scrolls confiscated as artifacts of historical interest rather than living documents of divine revelation. Mosques that continued the 5 daily prayers in the traditional manner, that taught the Quran as the final and uncorrupted word of God, that maintained the separation between believers and unbelievers, were converted into community centers where the new universal rituals were practiced. The faithful were driven underground, meeting in secret, whispering their prayers in basements and forests, their sacred texts hidden in walls and buried in gardens, their children taught in hushed voices about a God who seemed to have abandoned them to this darkness. The third operation was the educational indoctrination, a seizure of the next generation so complete that it made the totalitarian experiments of the previous century seem like amateur attempts. Children were removed from their families at increasingly early ages, placed in state creches from infancy, where they were raised by professionals trained in the new pedagogical methods. The bonds between parent and child were systematically weakened, presented as primitive attachments that hindered the development of proper citizenship. Breastfeeding was discouraged as creating unhealthy dependencies, co-sleeping criminalized as dangerous, homeschooling outlawed as a violation of children's rights to comprehensive education. By the age of 3, most children were spending the majority of their waking hours in institutional care, and by 7, they were enrolled in residential programs where they saw their parents only on scheduled visitation days, if at all. The curriculum they received was designed to erase every trace of the old ways. They were taught that the religions of their ancestors were fairy tales, myths developed by ignorant people who did not understand the natural world, stories that had caused wars and suffering, and that humanity had now outgrown. They learned that the global leader was the highest expression of human evolution, the exemplar of virtue, the father figure who loved them more than their biological parents ever could. They were trained to report any deviation from approved thinking, any whisper of the old faith, any expression of loyalty to family over state. Their loyalty was tested constantly, their privacy non-existent, their development monitored by artificial intelligence systems that identified any signs of rebellion before they could fully form. By the time they reached adulthood, they were fully formed citizens of the new world, incapable of imagining any alternative, suspicious of the very concept of transcendence, devoted to the system that had raised them with a fervor that no previous generation had brought to their inherited faiths. The fourth operation was the dissident purge, the systematic elimination of those who refused to participate in the new order. Those who rejected the financial system, who maintained their traditional religious practices, who kept their children at home, who spoke against the global leader, these were labeled with terms that made them appear dangerous not just to the state but to their fellow citizens. They were called reality deniers, accused of rejecting scientific consensus, of endangering public health, of threatening the social fabric with their intolerance and their extremism. The propaganda was relentless, portraying these holdouts as mentally ill, as infected with dangerous delusions, as potential terrorists who might lash out at any moment. The relocation was presented as humanitarian, as providing these troubled individuals with the care and treatment they needed to reintegrate into society. But I saw the reality of the re-education zones, the camps established in remote areas where the inconvenient could be processed away from public view. I saw the barbed wire and the guard towers, the forced labor and the psychological torture, the medical experiments and the mass graves. I saw people of faith forced to wear identifying symbols, yellow patches for the Jews who refused to abandon their covenant, red crosses for the Christians who would not deny their Lord, green crescents for the Muslims who maintained their submission to Allah alone. These symbols made them targets for harassment by their neighbors, for discrimination in any remaining private transactions, for arrest and relocation when the authorities decided they had become too visible. I watched as families were separated at the gates of these camps, husbands from wives, parents from children, the young taken for re-education, the old deemed too set in their ways to save. I saw the interrogations, the sleep deprivation, the drugs that broke down resistance, the techniques refined through decades of research into human psychology. I saw those who broke, who signed the documents renouncing their faith, who agreed to take the mark and participate in the universal worship, who betrayed their fellow believers to save themselves or their families. And I saw those who did not break, who sang hymns as they were led to the execution chambers, who prayed for their torturers, who died with the names of their God on their lips, becoming witnesses in blood to a truth that the New World had tried to bury but could not destroy. The four operations worked together with terrible efficiency. The financial ceiling ensured that resistance was materially impossible, that even those with the courage to stand could not feed their families or keep themselves warm. The religious synthesis removed the spiritual resources that might have sustained resistance, replacing the God of the ages with a vague sentiment that demanded nothing and therefore gave nothing. The educational indoctrination ensured that the next generation would not even understand what had been lost, would look at the resistors as dangerous lunatics rather than heroes of conscience. And the dissident purge eliminated those who remained, either by breaking them and incorporating them back into the system, or by removing them from the earth entirely. The result was a world that appeared peaceful, prosperous, unified, but at the cost of everything that made humanity worth preserving: the freedom to believe, to love, to raise one's children, to speak truth, to hope in something beyond the present moment. The darkness was not the chaos of war but the suffocation of total control, and it was more terrible than any battlefield I had ever imagined. I watched as national borders dissolved like wax before a flame, those lines on maps that had been drawn in blood and defended with treasure over centuries losing all meaning in the span of months. The dissolution was not merely political but existential, a fundamental restructuring of how humanity organized itself that went deeper than any revolution or conquest in recorded history. The nation-state, that form of political organization that had dominated the modern era, proved to have been a temporary arrangement, a phase in human development that was now giving way to something the architects of global governance had been planning for generations. The borders did not disappear through war, for the most part, though there was violence enough. They dissolved through a combination of crisis and consent, through the collapse of the old and the embrace of the new that promised relief from chaos. The United States was the most dramatic example of this dissolution, a superpower that had projected military force across the globe, reduced to fragments within weeks. The trigger was a series of coordinated cyber attacks of unprecedented sophistication, targeting not military installations but civilian infrastructure, the soft underbelly of modern life that had been neglected while resources flowed to foreign wars. The power grid was the primary target, its vulnerabilities exploited by malware that had been planted years before, lying dormant until the signal was given. When the attacks commenced, the effect was immediate and devastating. The electrical infrastructure that powered the world's largest economy collapsed in a cascade of failures that engineers could not stop or reverse. The lights went out in New York, In Los Angeles, in Chicago, in Houston, in every major city and most minor ones. And they stayed out not for hours but for weeks. 3 weeks without electricity in a modern urban environment is a death sentence for civilization. The water pumps stopped, and taps ran dry. The refrigeration failed and food spoiled in warehouses and homes. The gasoline could not be pumped, and transportation halted. The hospitals lost their life support systems, and patients died in darkness. The communication networks collapsed, and panic spread without the moderating influence of information. The police could not respond to emergencies, and the strong began to prey upon the weak with impunity. The National Guard was overwhelmed, called out to protect government buildings while neighborhoods burned. The federal government, its authority already weakened by decades of polarization and paralysis, proved incapable of coordinating a response, each state looking to its own survival while the center could not hold. When the lights finally returned, brought back not by American engineers but by international teams dispatched by the global authority, the Constitution had been suspended temporarily, an emergency measure that was presented as necessary to restore order and provide the resources that the fractured federal system could not deliver. The temporary nature of the suspension was emphasized repeatedly, with promises that normal governance would return once the crisis had passed. But the temporary became permanent as one emergency followed another, each one requiring the continued exercise of extraordinary powers that concentrated authority in the hands of unelected administrators accountable to the global system, rather than to any local constituency. The 50 states found themselves reorganized into regional zones that crossed traditional boundaries, their governors replaced by coordinators appointed from above, their national guards federalized into a continental security force that answered to the new order. Russia and China, the great rivals of the American era, followed a different path to the same destination. Their confrontation had been building for years: territorial disputes in the Arctic, competition for resources in Africa, proxy conflicts in Central Asia that grew increasingly direct. The brief war that erupted was terrifying in its intensity, a clash of nuclear-armed powers that brought the world to the brink of annihilation. The exchange was limited, a few tactical weapons deployed before sanity prevailed, but the damage was sufficient to demonstrate that the old way of great power competition was no longer survivable. The radioactive fallout drifted across borders, the economic disruption spread globally, and the realization dawned on both Moscow and Beijing that their rivalry was destroying the very world they were competing to dominate. Their submission to the global authority was presented as a voluntary choice for peace, a recognition that humanity had to transcend the nation-state system to survive the technologies it had created. In reality, it was a surrender dictated by exhaustion and fear, by the understanding that the next war would leave no victors. The Russian Federation and the Chinese People's Republic became administrative regions within the new structure, their military forces integrated into a global peacekeeping apparatus, their nuclear arsenals placed under international control, their leaders granted ceremonial positions that masked their loss of real authority. The proud empires that had resisted American hegemony found themselves absorbed into a system that made the American era look like an age of liberty by comparison. Europe had already fallen before the crisis reached its peak, so exhausted by its own guilt and decline that it welcomed the strong hand of the new order with something approaching relief. The European Union had been the laboratory for this transition, an experiment in transcending nationalism that had prepared the continent's populations for the final step. The endless crises of the previous decades, the currency collapses, the debt emergencies, the migration waves, the terrorist attacks, had worn away the resistance of populations who once valued their distinct identities. By the time the global authority offered its solutions, the Europeans were too tired to refuse, too frightened of a return to the chaos that had preceded the new stability. They accepted the dissolution of their remaining sovereignty with minimal protest, their capitals becoming mere provincial headquarters in a system that governed from elsewhere. Israel was the last to submit, the stubborn holdout that resisted the new order longer than any other nation. The Jewish state had survived through centuries of persecution by developing a capacity for resistance that had become part of its national character, and that character did not dissolve easily. The global authority applied pressure gradually at first, economic sanctions that made trade difficult, diplomatic isolation that turned Israel into a pariah state, cultural boycotts that made its artists and academics unwelcome in international forums. But the Israeli economy was resilient, its people accustomed to sacrifice, its military formidable even against the combined pressure of the world. The global authority could have crushed Israel by force, but that would have destroyed the image of peaceful transition that was essential to its legitimacy. So it waited, patient and confident, for the pressure point that would bring the Jewish state to heel. That pressure point was the temple. The completion of the Third Temple had been the dream of religious Jews for 2 millennia, the focus of prayers and longings that had sustained the diaspora through centuries of exile. The global authority made clear that the temple could be completed, that the sacrifices could resume, that the ancient prophecies could be fulfilled, but only within the framework of the new order. The temple would be a house of prayer for all nations, the leader declared, not just for one. It would not be the exclusive domain of Jewish worship, but a center for the new universal religion that synthesized all faiths. The Sanhedrin that had been reconstituted to govern Jewish religious law would be replaced by an interfaith council that included representatives of the synthesized faiths, ensuring that the temple served the global community rather than any particular tradition. The bargain was struck in secret negotiations that lasted for months, religious leaders meeting with secular authorities in neutral locations, debating the terms that would allow the temple's completion while ensuring its subordination to the new order. The details were complex, involving the architecture of the building, the scheduling of sacrifices, the management of the Temple Mount, the rites of pilgrims from different traditions. But the essential compromise was clear. Israel would get its temple, but it would not get its sovereignty. The Jewish state would be allowed to exist, but only as a province within the global system, its military integrated, its economy absorbed, its laws subordinated to international standards. When the agreement was announced, the reaction within Israel was divided. The secular majority, exhausted by decades of conflict and isolation, welcomed the deal as a path to normalization, to acceptance, to the end of the siege mentality that had defined their lives. The religious establishment was split, some seeing the temple as worth any price, others recognizing that a temple built on compromise and dedicated to universalism was worse than no temple at all. The government fell, new elections were held, and a coalition emerged that accepted the terms, calculating that the survival of the Jewish people required adaptation to a world that had changed irrevocably. My people would be scattered again, those who refused. This was the final provision of the bargain, the price of admission to the new world. The Jews who maintained that the temple belonged exclusively to the God of Israel, that the sacrifices were for the atonement of Israel alone, that the covenant was particular and not universal. These were declared extremists, obstacles to peace, enemies of the new order. They were offered the choice of compliance or exile, the opportunity to participate in the new temple on the new terms, or to be removed from the land their ancestors had died to reclaim. Many complied, their longing for the temple overcoming their theological reservations, their desire for acceptance outweighing their commitment to the ancient faith. But a remnant refused, and for them the old pattern repeated, the scattering that had been the Jewish fate through centuries of exile becoming once again their lived experience. I watched as these resistors were driven from their homes in Judea and Samaria, from their neighborhoods in Jerusalem, from their communities in the Galilee. Their properties were confiscated for the crime of intolerance, Their synagogues closed for inciting division. Their schools shuttered for teaching hatred. Some fled to underground networks, meeting in secret to maintain the ancient practices, their children learning Torah by candlelight in basements and caves. Others were captured and sent to the re-education camps, their faith tested by every means of psychological pressure and physical deprivation. Still others managed to escape the land entirely, becoming refugees once again, wandering the earth with no homeland, no protection, no rights, the eternal witnesses to a truth that the world had decided to forget. The temple stood completed, gleaming in the Jerusalem sun, the pride of the new order and the symbol of its victory over particularity. The sacrifices were offered, but not as the Torah commanded, not for the atonement of Israel, not according to the ancient rites, but as a performance for tourists, a spectacle for the universal pilgrimage, a ritual emptied of its meaning and refilled with the ideology of synthesis. The priests wore vestments that incorporated symbols from every tradition. The prayers were translated into 100 languages. The festivals were celebrated as global holidays rather than Jewish holy days. And in the shadows, my people wept, remembering what had been lost, preserving the truth in their hearts for a day when the covenant would be restored, and the temple would truly be the house of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not the monument to human ambition that it had become. After these things had been revealed, the vision shifted upward, drawing my attention from the affairs of earth to the vast expanse of the heavens above. I understood that a sequence was being established, a progression of events that would culminate in the final intervention of divine history into human time. The message conveyed was clear and urgent. The culmination was not distant, not something for future generations to anticipate, but imminent, pressing upon the present moment with an immediacy that would transform days into eternities and make every hour precious. The return was not years away, not months in the future, but measured in days and weeks, a countdown that had begun and could not be reversed. I looked up in the vision and witnessed phenomena that defied natural explanation, events that operated on laws beyond those governing ordinary celestial mechanics. The sun, that burning sphere that had warmed and illuminated Earth since creation, underwent a transformation that astronomers could neither predict nor explain. It turned black, not the black of absence but a deeper darkness, as though the light itself had been withdrawn or compressed into some hidden dimension. The darkness was not uniform. It pulsed and shifted, creating patterns that seemed almost intentional, almost communicative, as though the sun had become a signal rather than a source. The temperature on Earth dropped precipitously, crops failing in the sudden winter, oceans beginning to freeze at their edges, yet the darkness was not merely physical but spiritual, a palpable weight that pressed upon the souls of all who lived beneath it. Simultaneously, the moon underwent its own metamorphosis, changing from its familiar silver to the color of blood. This was not the reddish hue of an ordinary lunar eclipse, when Earth's shadow filters sunlight through its atmosphere. This was a saturation, a soaking of the lunar surface in crimson that made it appear as though the moon itself had been wounded, had bled across its face and now hung in the sky as a warning, a witness, a testimony to approaching judgment. The blood moon cast an eerie crimson light upon the earth below, turning the snow red, making the oceans appear to be vast fields of wine, transforming the faces of those who looked up into masks of alarm and confusion. The combination of black sun and blood moon created an atmosphere of dread that no science could dispel, a cosmic disturbance that spoke directly to the ancient instincts of humanity, awakening fears that had been buried beneath layers of civilization and technology. Accompanying these lunar and solar transformations were celestial events that the world's scientific establishment would struggle to categorize and explain. Stars appeared to fall from their fixed positions, not the streaking meteors that astronomers tracked and catalogued, but points of light that detached from the fabric of the night and descended toward Earth like fireflies on a summer evening. They moved with apparent intention, following trajectories that defied gravitational calculation, clustering in formations that could not be random, creating patterns in the sky that spelled out warnings visible to any who had eyes to see. The world's media would eventually settle on explanations involving meteor showers, solar anomalies, atmospheric distortions caused by climate change, magnetic field disruptions, any naturalistic interpretation that would prevent the population from recognizing the supernatural nature of what was occurring. But those who belonged to the faithful remnant, those who had resisted the mark and maintained their testimony, would know in their spirits what the scientists denied with their instruments. They would feel it in the core of their being, a resonance that transcended intellectual understanding, a drawing near that communicated itself through means more subtle than sight or sound. The bridegroom was approaching, and his bride could sense his footsteps even when the wedding hall remained unseen. This knowledge was not doctrinal but experiential, not learned but imparted, a gift of the spirit that bypassed the rational mind and spoke directly to the recreated heart. They would wake in the night with an urgency they could not explain, would find themselves weeping with joy and longing in moments of ordinary activity, would experience a homesickness for a place they had never visited, a reunion with a person they had never met in the flesh. Then would come the trumpet sounds, piercing the atmosphere with frequencies that operated on spiritual wavelengths. These were not the blasts of earthly instruments, not the horns of armies or the signals of warning systems, but pure tones that resonated in the depths of the human spirit. The lost could not perceive them, their spiritual senses having been deadened by years of denial and suppression, their ears attuned only to the frequencies of the material world. But to those who were his, the sound was unmistakable, a call that had been anticipated since childhood, since conversion, since the first moment of awakening to the reality of the divine. The trumpet spoke of completion, of fulfillment, of the end of the long night of waiting and the beginning of the eternal day of presence. This would be the final warning, the last opportunity for those who had delayed to make their decision, for the undecided to choose their allegiance, for the compromised to repent and return. The convergence of signs would leave no room for ambiguity. The global leader established in Jerusalem, exercising authority over the nations, the economic ceiling that separated the marked from the unmarked, the heavenly disturbances that announced the approach of the one who had promised to return. These three, the political, the economic, the cosmic, would come together in a convergence that would be impossible to ignore, a triangulation that would fix the coordinates of history's end and eternity's beginning. The knowledge that he stood at the door would transform the remaining time into something precious beyond calculation. Every moment would become an opportunity for witness, every conversation a potential last chance, every prayer an urgent petition for mercy upon those still outside. The believers would understand that the door was about to close, that the ark was about to be sealed, that the wedding feast was about to begin, and the invitations would no longer be extended. This understanding would drive them to acts of courage they had never believed themselves capable of, to testimonies in the face of certain death, to love that overflowed its containers and spilled into the streets, drawing the last of the elect into the fold before the shepherd called his sheep, and the separation became permanent. Suddenly, I felt a pulling sensation, as though an invisible tether had been fastened around my spirit and was now drawing me backward, away from the luminous garden, and toward a heaviness I had forgotten but now recognized as the imprisonment of flesh. The sensation was not violent but insistent, a cord of obligation that reminded me that my sojourn in this realm was temporary, that the death which had released me was being reversed, that life was reclaiming what death had briefly borrowed. The figure before me communicated without words that my time in this place was not yet complete, that the appointment with eternity had been postponed, that there remained work to be done in the land of the living before I could take up permanent residence among the blessed. I was given to understand that I must return and speak of all that I had witnessed, that the visions were not for my private edification, but for public proclamation. The knowledge imparted was not a treasure to be hoarded, but a burden to be shared, a responsibility that would define whatever days remained to me on earth. I was warned that the reception would not be welcoming, that the message would encounter resistance at every turn. Not all who heard would believe, their hearts having been hardened by the very conditions I had been shown, their minds captured by the deceptions that would already be taking hold. Many would respond with mockery, treating my testimony as the delusion of a dying brain, the hallucination of oxygen deprivation, the fantasy of a religious imagination overheated by decades of esoteric study. Some would actively seek to silence me, recognizing the threat that such truth represented to the systems of control being established, understanding that a witness who had seen behind the veil could not be allowed to speak freely without endangering the grand deception. Yet despite these warnings, or perhaps because of them, I felt something igniting within my being, a fire that had been kindled by the touch of the divine and now could not be extinguished. The words were not merely thoughts to be articulated but flames in my bones, consuming my reservations, burning away my fear, compelling me to speak regardless of the cost. This was not the fire of destruction but the fire of prophecy, the ancient burden that had driven the seers of Israel to speak to kings and commoners alike, that had sent Jeremiah to the dungeon and Daniel to the lion's den, that had sustained the witnesses of every age who preferred death to silence. I understood that I would no longer be able to contain what I had seen, that the pressure of the vision would burst through any barrier I might erect, that I would speak or I would die, and perhaps both. The conflict within me was acute. I wanted to stay in that garden where the light was so beautiful, so complete, so utterly satisfying that the memory of earthly existence seemed like a dim shadow by comparison. The desire to remain was physical, a longing that pulled against the tether that drew me away, a homesickness for a home I had only just discovered. The beauty of that realm was not merely aesthetic but ontological, a rightness that made everything else seem broken and partial. To return to the world of pain and confusion, of politics and deception, of aging bodies and failing systems, this seemed like a punishment rather than a commission, a descent into darkness after having tasted the light. But hands were placed upon my shoulders, gentle but firm, and through that touch came the assurance that the return was not abandonment, that the light would go with me, that the presence I had encountered would sustain me through the trials ahead. Then the weight began to return, slowly at first and then with crushing suddenness. The weight of 73 years accumulated in flesh and bone, the weight of a heart that had failed and was now being forced to beat again, the weight of lungs that had stopped and now must draw breath once more. The pain returned, not gradually but in a rush that made me gasp, the arthritis in my joints, the surgical incision in my chest, the rawness of a throat that had been intubated for days. The beeping of machines assaulted my ears. The mechanical rhythm of monitors tracking vital signs that had been absent and were now struggling to reestablish their patterns. The shouting of surgeons reached me, their voices urgent with the surprise of success, the excitement of a resuscitation that had exceeded their expectations, the professional thrill of cheating death one more time. I felt the cold of the operating table beneath me, the pressure of restraints that had been applied to prevent movement, the sting of fluids being forced into my veins through needles that sought collapsed vessels. When I opened my eyes 3 days later in the recovery room, consciousness returning like a tide that would not be denied, the first thing I did was ask for a pen. My family thought I was delirious, the nurses thought I was confused, the doctors thought I was demonstrating the cognitive effects of oxygen deprivation. But I knew exactly what I was doing. The visions were already fading from the perfect clarity of the supernatural into the imperfect memory of the natural, and I feared losing a single detail, a single date, a single warning that might mean the difference for someone who would read my words. This document that I have dictated, that others have transcribed and translated and distributed, is my testimony, the seal of my witness, the deposit of my experience against the day when these things shall come to pass, and the world shall know that there was a witness who saw and spoke. The dates approach with a speed that terrifies me. I have seen the calendar turn, watched the seasons cycle, felt the acceleration of events that I was shown. The signs will not be subtle when they come. They will be unmistakable to any who have ears to hear and eyes to see. The convergence of political, economic, and celestial phenomena will leave no room for ambiguity, no space for denial, no possibility of explaining away what is unfolding. Therefore, I exhort all who read these words to prepare their hearts, to examine their faith, to settle their accounts with the divine while there remains time. For that which is written will surely come to pass. Not one word shall fall to the ground, and he who promised is faithful to complete what he has begun, to return for his own, to establish his kingdom, and to make all things new.